Hello, and welcome to another virtual episode of Real Film Snobs. I'm Angela Yeager.
And I'm Brian Michael. I'm all the way, I'm on the other side of town than Angela. I'm not that far.
Yeah. So today we have a very special episode for you. We have, Brian and I are going to be talking about our favorite actresses. This is called Film Snobs Favorites. And we're going to talk about, we each picked one actress from the past and one from the present. And we're going to talk about why they're our favorites. And it's not just because they're really awesome. There's actually film snob reasons for these things. So kind of talk about their career, the types of performances they did, and of course, the directors they worked with. So let's start with my first actress. This is a favorite actress of the past, and mine is Barbara Stanwyck. So I recently went through a bunch of pre-code Barbara Stanwyck movies, and it was pretty amazing to see the breadth of her career. She was born in 1907 and passed away in 1990. And, unlike many actresses who maybe only have one decade, maybe two if they're lucky, of, solid work, Barbara Stanwyck started her career in the early 30s before the Hollywood Code came into effect. And unlike actresses like Mae West, she was able to have a career way past the code, even though she was known for playing more racy roles. So her pre-code era includes movies like Night Nurse and Babyface and The Bitter Tea of General Yen. And then she went on to make some of her most famous films in the 1940s, which I guess some people might consider her heyday. And those include classics like The Lady Eve, Meet John Doe, and of course, one of my all-time favorites, Double Indemnity. She went on in the 1950s to do some really interesting, and I think in some ways, some of her most esoteric work, including The Furies, Clash by Night, and 40 Guns. So I want to let Brian chime in here, and then I want to talk about some of the directors, some of the directors she worked with.
Yeah, what my favorite thing about actresses is just being able to have the versatility. And that's mostly what I was going to be concentrating with actresses that I chose. But I do love that with Barbara Stanwyck, you have something like Double Indemnity with 41 Guns. I mean, she's actually in the country or the Cowboy Hall of Fame.
Yeah,
it's not surprising once you look at her career, but I was like, wait, what? And, you've seen her play the femme fatale. You've also seen her play the love interest. She's been the main character. And even when we, other movies, like earlier today, we were watching one. I said, what if Barbara Stanwyck was in this film? And you were like, she would just slap people around because they were being foolish. She always played a strong-willed person. She was never, if she was a victim, she certainly was someone who took strides to balance the books, so to speak, unless the code was certainly against her, the filmmaking code. It's hard to think of a bad performance. I don't know if she's ever had one. When I was a kid, she was in The Big Valley, which is a television show, Western television show that I remember because $6 Million Man was on it before he was the $6 Million Man. But
right.
I always loved her performance in that. She was certainly the staple in that show. And again, she always found work. Actors will take the work. It doesn't always matter, how big and or glamorous it was, even if it was television after she was a film star. She always took the work, always honed her craft, always practiced on the craft. And yeah, I mean, she was absolutely fantastic, and she's my second favorite actress. I hate the fact that people say she was an actress, and someone like Katharine Hepburn, who we'll talk about here in a second, is a movie star. Okay, sure, but I always love Barbara Stanwyck. I can't think of a bad performance. Honestly, I can't.
No, she didn't have a lot, and she even in I watched some of those pre-code. They had a whole bunch of her pre-code movies on Criterion Channel not too long ago, and some of them were of varying quality. Some of them were great, But even in the kind of cheesier ones that she was in, I mean, for a while there, she was making like 3 or 4 films a year. She made 107 in her career. She still brought something to those performances. And she, as you mentioned, she went on to do television in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, on quite a few different television series. But I wrote down I started listing the directors she worked with. And after a while, I was just like, this is ridiculous. So here's just a few, and classic film buffs will just realize how amazing this list is. Sam Fuller, Fritz Lang, Howard Hawks, Billy Wilder, Frank Capra, Preston Sturges, King Vidor, and George Stevens. That's just to name a few. That was just me clicking through them, some of the most well-known ones. That's a pretty amazing list. And Frank Capra, interestingly, she worked with the most. And I think that that's interesting, partially because Frank Capra is known as a very sentimental director. He, did a lot of kind of feel-good, tug-at-your-heartstrings type movies, which you wouldn't necessarily, think of with Barbara Stanwyck. But I think her edge just brought the right tone to his films. I think about some of her performances in his films, like Meet John Doe. She brings the edge that films needs. Otherwise, it'd be just a little too syrupy. So yeah, and I think it was really tough because your favorite is probably my second favorite, or maybe my first, depending on, which I just got through watching all these Stanwyck movies, so she kind of rose to my top right now.
So mine, my favorite from the classic period is Katharine Hepburn, and I know that's kind of shooting fish in a barrel. She is Katherine the Great. I think 4 Academy Awards, with a long, I feel like a Tim Duncan type career she has, or Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. She's got a long period of greatness at the beginning and all the way towards the end, many decades. And what I always liked about her is that she always played a smart character as well. She was never a fool. She might be daffy, but she was never stupid. And I always appreciated that. And she was someone that once she got some box office draw, she used that power to control her future and to be able to pick the directors she worked with, to be able to work with the actors she worked with. And if Cary Grant wanted more and more money, then she was going to be earning. That was fine. She didn't care. She could have top billing. She wanted to get certain projects done and work with certain people. And I always appreciate that about her. Of course, one of my favorite all-time films is Bringing Up Baby, and she's fantastic in it. There's also Holiday that I absolutely love so much. She worked a lot with George Cukor, who was a woman's director, but she was smart. She grabbed onto certain directors and knew that she could get the quality film made. She worked with David Lean. She worked with Howard Hawks. George Stevens as well. She worked with She worked alongside John Wayne, which I always think is really interesting. But she also worked with John Ford before John Wayne. Before she had worked with John Wayne. So I always think that's really interesting as well. The only thing that I would say, if we were to split hairs about these two, is that period pieces are kind of tough. They could do Westerns, but period pieces, as in like costume dramas, that's tough. And I'll get to that a little bit later. She also worked along with Burt Lancaster. She worked with Humphrey Bogart. Of course, she obviously worked with Spencer Tracy, which I still struggle with Spencer Tracy, especially when he's across the aisle from her, because I would say that she was always really good with a lot of actors. She didn't blow anybody out of the water, but Spencer Tracy just never did much for me. So she always kind of towered over him, in my opinion. Now, she always played, a lot of times would play someone with, from high society, of a certain standard or a certain wealth, a certain influence. Mostly, I think because of that accent of hers was really hard for her to break. She wasn't a Meryl Streep where she put a wig on and did a different accent and disappeared into these different roles.
She never played anyone from the Bronx.
Yeah, no, and that's fine because again, the quality of the work was always there, and I love the people that she worked with and the projects that she worked on. And if you're going to see her in a film, you're never going to be disappointed.
Almost the opposite, actually. And it's sort of interesting to think about her and Stanwyck. Stanwyck, I think she played a rich lady a few times, upper crust, but not a lot. She often played working class people. In fact, she was very proud of that. She made a comment once in an interview that she rarely had characters that didn't have jobs, which in the 30s, 40s, and 50s was unusual. A lot of times actresses were housewives, wives, society ladies, etc. They didn't have to work. And Stanwyck played journalists and all sorts of prostitutes, but a wide variety of secretaries, lawyers, etc. Katharine Hepburn, sort of the other end of the spectrum, often, as you mentioned, played higher society ladies, but she did have comedic timing. You really see that in Bringing Up Baby. Philadelphia Story. She worked with Cary Grant, one of the great actors of all time, quite a bit, and they were great foils for each other.
Yeah, and she wasn't afraid to look foolish on screen. Like I said, she could play daffy characters such as I'm Bringing Up Baby or even in Holiday and stuff. And she wasn't afraid to do a pratfall. She wasn't afraid to do, those things that would some actresses who might think themselves above. And
Mm-hmm.
I always appreciate that about her. And she was like, one of the first actresses that I kind of started noticing. Again, it is really hard, especially for women in Hollywood, once they hit 30, when do you start playing the mom roles? 35, 32,
Yeah,
something
about
like that.
35.
And then after 45, then you just disappear, and then you're going to play grandma later down the line if you're still
Right.
around, luckily, and if you haven't cut up your face too much. So, and then you can emote. But she was able to have a long career, and so you always get to see a lot of her, especially growing up with Channel 12, as I always say, the KATU kids or KBTV kids, and saw a lot of her films on TV. So, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of great performances. Gosh, I didn't even look to see how many are listed in here. Let's see,
A lot.
80. Well, Letterboxd says 80, and I have seen a very low percentage of those movies. That's very surprising. But yeah, so they got a lot to look forward to, apparently.
Well, she did a lot in her later career, and like a lot of actresses, her later movies are not always her absolute best. She was often typecast in the later part of her career as a spinster, as sort of a lonely older woman, but she
Yeah.
really was dedicated to continue working, and you got to admire that she, like Stanwyck, really continued working, almost basically up until the end of her life. And again, very unusual in those days. They both had a career that started in the 30s and went through the 80s or 90s, which is pretty, depending on which one you're talking about. So, which is pretty impressive. Yeah.
Oh yeah.
Exactly.
Oh yeah, and it's still the high bar, really, of what a lot of actresses, still talk about when they talk about their favorites or someone they aspire to or someone that inspired them. So,
Exactly.
yeah, I mean, if this seems pretty basic, and that's why I kind of, it's fundamental here. But it's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this, because we hadn't really ever actually talked about this, and reasons why you would choose a favorite actress, not just because you like the movies that they're in, but also there's something to be said about them being challenged and taking on challenging roles and who they work with. And when they put together it's not just some glamour role where they look, fantastic. Boy, I can think of a couple actresses. I'm not going to drop any names, but I like the fact that they're putting together, an ensemble and someone that they can work with and someone they can bounce back and forth with. They enjoy working where it's not just highlighting them and everyone else is just, secondary thought.
Right, exactly. They both did that. And in their later part of their career, like Stanwyck in 40 Guns, and in my opinion, one of her greatest performances in The Furies. She's just amazing. And, she was in her 40s at that period, so considered over the hill by Hollywood standards, but which is why, she started doing TV in the 60s, because she was so old, about 50 probably.
She did her own stunts in 41 Guns, I believe. There's a few of the stunts she did herself. So.
Oh, that doesn't surprise me. She was she was a tough cookie. She came from very humble beginnings, and she had an amazing work ethic. In fact, Marilyn Monroe in Clash by Night said that she was one of the only actresses who was ever nice to her. So I thought that was a really nice quote that she worked with. So let's talk about present. This one was harder for me, actually, because, you still have a few years to go. Some of these people, there's other ones that I considered that I thought, this was really close. So I'm going to go with the one I ended up choosing. And again, some of this is influenced by current viewing that I'm doing. But I picked Juliette Binoche, who was born in 1964 and has had also a very lengthy career, actually. She started in the 1980s with films like The Unbearable Lightness of Being, and I cannot pronounce this, but Ma Voix Song by Leo Carax, a director she ended up working with quite a bit, and The Lovers on a Bridge. So she did both of those films with Leo Carax. Then she went on in the 1990s to make movies like Damage and Three Colors Blue, which is part of the Three Colors trilogy, one of the masterpieces of cinema. And The English Patient, very interesting.
I love that movie, by the way. That movie gets a lot of flack now. I love that movie.
Why does it get flack? I still like The English Patient.
It's considered one of those movies that shouldn't have won. I forget which one was supposed to win Best Picture, but blah, blah, blah.
I think The English Patient still holds up.
It might have been Fargo. Whoops. But anyway, yeah. No, I think it's a great movie.
And then in the zeros, and then here's the interesting, going into the third and then fourth decades of her career, she's kind of made even the most interesting movies of her career. We'll just skip over Chocolat, which is one of her most popular movies and also one of her worst, with Johnny Depp. But she then in the 2000s, she went on to make movies like Flight of the Red Balloon, Cachet, Summer Hours, Certified Copy, Els, Clouds of Sils Maria, Nonfiction, High Life. I mean, I could just go on and on. And speaking of directors, one thing that's interesting about her, even early in her career in the 80s, she worked with great French directors, the greatest directors of the French, the second new wave, as they call it, with Leo Carax, I already mentioned, Claire Denis, Godard, she worked with him in one film, Olivier Assayas, Bruno Dumont. But then she also worked with a lot of non-French directors, everyone from Cronenberg and Michael Haneke, Anthony Minghella, as we mentioned with English Patient, Abbas Kiarostami, who's Iranian, Kieslowski for the Three Colors trilogy, Philip Kaufman. So, I mean, it's pretty amazing. And that's one of the reasons I picked her, because when I looked at the director she worked with, it reminded me of these classic actresses. She picks movies, she picks daring performances. She's not afraid of bearing her soul and other parts of her body. She's played everything from the ingenue in her early career with her, you know, fresh little chubby cheeks and unbearable lightness of being, to vixens, to villains, and just really complicated female characters. And she's continued to just try to pick really interesting projects, even though, and she's at that age you would think she'd be slowing down, and she's working just as much as ever.
What was the one we just watched, the outer space one where she's in?
High Life with
that was you know, that's you know, and I'll say this about my next actress as well, is that when you see that person listed or see them in there, you're like, well, at least, you know, I got to see that, because you want to be able to see, you know, the project, even if it's something that I didn't necessarily like. It's very interesting and it's very challenging, and you can always enjoy certainly her performance. And I don't want to, you know, especially when you're talking about actresses here, we don't want to just lionize or ostracize another, but she came around the same time that Julia Roberts did. And I'm not a big Julia Roberts fan. My father's a favorite actress, but she came around the same time. And when you look at those movies, you know, was there ever been a Juliette Binoche movie where, you know, they did a nice close-up on her and then did a montage of her trying on different clothes or doing different things and having a soundtrack to some song where she's doing something really cutesy? And I think of, like, you know, Sleeping with the Enemy or Pretty Woman or something like that, you know. And of course those are Hollywood pictures, so it's a little tougher, you know, but look at the choices that were made and the people that they got to work with. And
right.
Robert Sleeves got to work with, Soderbergh. She was smart with that way. But when you start to look at, after a while, when you kind of do the same thing over and over, that Hollywood star kind of fades. And that's one of the things that can happen when you get someone who's an actress that's really looking for challenging roles and working with certain directors and latching onto them. Then you're going to see a career sustained.
It's true.
And, you know, and I'll say it out there for a lot of men or women, you know, if you're going to be dealing with the male gaze, which is something that's, you know, hopefully going to be phased out here in the next decade or so. But if you're going to have one, Juliette Binoche is not a bad one, because she is definitely one of the great beauties that when you do want to see someone like that, you want to see an interesting performance, but it's not so bad when you see someone that's drop dead gorgeous. I mean, she is one of the all-time great lookers. That is, the sound went out, you know, you could at least be able to enjoy her, certainly her looks, but also her, you know, expressions and her performance. But yeah, she's definitely one of those it's so underrated, especially in America. I think in the world cinema, everyone just goes, yeah, Juliette Binoche. But here in America, I just wish she had the same regard as everyone else did.
Yeah, and you're right to point out her beauty as well as her very confident sexuality, which never feels exploitive. You know, she works with directors who know how to use that, and she feels like she's fully in control at all times. And yeah, the world cinema, that's why I think it's so interesting. She's an actress of the world, and comparing her, you know, to actresses that started around the same time, like Julia Roberts, she's never really just phoned it in. And she's done some Hollywood movies. English Patient, of course, she did a movie called Dan in Real Life, which was a comedy with Steve Carell. Yeah. And so she does mix it up, but she always tries to, I think, make it interesting, make it her own. She was in a Godzilla movie that I don't know if that was just a paycheck.
Oh, she was so good in it, though. I wanted to see it, and I was like, wait, she was only in the first 10 minutes? Come on, man.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
So I get to move on?
Yeah.
Okay, now it gets interesting, because we're going to move on to my, and so many, Juliette Moore, there's so many great actresses out there that I absolutely love, Reese Witherspoon. But I had to go with Tilda Swinton, because when she's in a movie, it's a must-see. And if the movie is terrible, then you can look for the YouTube clip and just watch her performances. This woman is the Lon Chaney of her generation. And I don't think we've had one really since then. You give her a buck, she can do a hunchback, she can play a vampire, she can play a mortician, she can play she can play a man. It does not matter. Tilda Swinton will play a rock if it's interesting. she can do it. She can do it so well. Whoops, that's the wrong list there. She has worked in Marvel films and did a great job. And she's also been in independent films. She's worked with Wes Anderson, so she's now played Afraid to Play Kooky and Strange. She's been with Jung Boon-ho, obviously, of course, in Snowpiercer, where she played a fantastically wicked, delicious villainess. She was Suspiria, where she played multiple parts that I was not aware of. That's the third part until the end of the movie, and went, oh, wait, she played that one too?
Yeah.
Which was pretty impressive. She's worked with the Coen brothers in their comedies, which is not an easy task. She's worked with Spike Jonze. She's worked with Jim Jarmusch, who I'm not a big fan of, but at least his best film, Only Lovers Still Left Alive, she played a vampire, and she was definitely the best part in The Dead Don't Die, where she played a mortician. She was in Trainwreck, along with Amy Schumer. In a
I almost forgot about that.
Yeah, in a big comedy, and she played it so well. She was really, really funny and played it very dry. And of course, she won an Academy Award for Michael Clayton, where I've never seen a character just melt and disassemble right there, where she was just absolutely shaken to the core. And that last scene, as great as George Clooney is, she just falls apart, and it's such an amazing scene. She, of course, was in Orlando. She can play period pieces. She can do it. I don't think she's actually done a Western, but she could. She's done period pieces. She's done all different types of breadth of work. And I Am Love, Julia, which is probably one of the most underrated performances ever. No one saw that movie, and I love that movie. It's the first independent film I showed my nephew. And then her next film is Pinocchio, with a director known as Guillermo del Toro, which is going to be sounds fantastic. That alone, I want to see.
That sounds interesting. Yeah,
I want to watch the lunch where they talk about the movie.
What is she playing in Pinocchio?
That I don't know. I just hadn't have a chance to look up what role it was. I just clicked on it on Letterboxd. Of course, they don't tell you the role they're going to play.
I'm glad you brought up.
She could play what? Geppetto. She could play the whale. She could play Pinocchio. She could play one of the Lost Boys. I mean, she could play anything. Doesn't matter.
Right. It's true. It's true, and she has done gender-bending roles. And in fact, I think they announced David Bowie planned biopic at some point, and people were like, "Is this even really a casting question?" But I don't think she's being casted.
And she got to work with him in his music video, and it was great.
Yeah, so, you're basically like looking at doubles probably. And she started her career working with experimental filmmakers like Derek Jarman and Sally Potter, who did Orlando. And so she is very interested. She's not afraid to do experimental films. You mentioned that she worked with Bong Joon-ho in Snowpiercer as well as Okja. And then she's like another one like Juliette Binoche, takes chances, isn't afraid to just really go all out. You're right. She's the best thing even in bad movies. I didn't like The Dead Don't Die, but I really loved her as she was the best thing in the movie. She was the only one who seemed like she wasn't sort of sleepwalking in it. And so I really appreciated that. You didn't mention, or unless I missed it because I was distracted by BB.
Yeah, I know my dog has opinions. BB.
BB saying, don't forget about We Need to Talk About Kevin, which is one of her greatest performances and maybe one of the best movies of the last decade. And she is amazing in that film and so unsettling. She can play, as you mentioned, a villain or a comedy or a very likable character. And in that one, a very complex character. So.
Yeah, I did forget to mention that was my favorite film of that particular year as well. And her quiet performance in that. And of course, it gives Ezra Miller, who was absolutely fantastic. And you could just see them both just going back and forth. And again, working with other actors and not blowing everybody off the screen. Sometimes it's a little hard for her because she plays so quirky and strange, but she does draw the eye a lot easier. But if she's working with, quality actors, then she gets to really go back and forth. And I always appreciate that. You can't just have someone that's, just blows everybody off the screen. That can gets kind of boring, or if it's just centered around them. I always think of somebody like Burt Reynolds. He's kind of made the same kind of movie. He was the focus of those movies, or Adam Sandler. And after a while, you're just tired of watching those movies, and you're just tired of seeing them on the screen, unless they do something like Uncut Gems. I know, but for the most part, that just gets tired and rote, and it's no fun. So when you get to see someone that's able to share the screen, do something that's interesting and follow along with it. I mean, I did not like The Dead Don't Die. I hated that movie, but I enjoyed her performance as a mortician that, swung a samurai sword and did kooky makeup. but she was the most memorable thing in that movie.
Yeah. Yeah. And she also, I think you mentioned I Am Love as well, but another actress who's not afraid of her sexuality and willing to, go all out with that. And not that that's necessarily but it is interesting that both her and Juliette Binoche, and then another actress who probably would have been a really close runner-up with both of those for my present, which would have been Julianne Moore. It was like right there. It was right between Julianne Moore and I think the reason I went with Juliette Binoche is she's being featured right now on Criterion Channel, and they have a bunch of her films that I hadn't seen, and I've been watching them, and I was just, again, amazed over and over. And Juliette Binoche has been working more actively in recent years, I think, than Julianne Moore. But Julianne Moore, another actress who works with interesting directors, is very confident, and also does very daring performances. So I think Tilda Swinton's definitely in that category as well. I just hope Tilda Swinton, I worry with her that she'll get typecast as kind of the quirky, like pull a Johnny Depp in her later career. I hope she doesn't do that.
No, she's already done
her in things like I Am Love, where she's, acting, playing a character and not just being the quirky, crazy one. Because with The Dead Don't Die, I worried about that a little bit.
No, she did that. She did like the Narnia movies, the Marvel movies. She's in the bigger ones, but then, she doesn't find those. She says that when did I mention I've met her twice? Very, very nice. She said it's really hard to make a movie that all the decisions have been made months ago. She said that's very strange to me. When I sat on the Narnia, it was like, no, this is what's going to happen. There's no improving. We're going to change this around. We're going to move an air camera angle. She's like, no, there's none of that. So, so you got to, really appreciate her chutzpah to, work on something that's very creative and continues to be creative as she's doing that.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this was a great episode. I think this was a lot of fun. We'll have to do actor next and cinematographer and some other fun things I think are on the horizon. So is it time to wrap up just about, I think?
Yep.
Yeah, so thank you for joining us virtually here again. We miss the Real Film Snobs crew. Thanks to all of you who support the show, and thanks to our wonderful sponsors. Again, we miss our crew. Thanks to my wonderful co-host, and thanks to Brad Wortman for taping this for us. You can check us out at realfilmsnobs.com and on YouTube and on Facebook. As always, have a great day and great movies.